All right, this is an introduction to literature of the Middle Ages, getting us started here in English 203. So, we're dealing roughly with a period of time that's about 300 years. And that comes from, that begins with the collapse of the Roman Empire and it runs all the way to the Renaissance period and Reformation. So the word medieval comes from the Latin medium, which means middle, and the word aevum, which means age, and it refers to whatever was made, written, or thought during this time period, during the Middle Ages. Okay. During the latter part of the 5th century, Britain was conquered by three Germanic tribes, and I talk about this a little bit more in detail in the history of the English language lecture, which is actually another part of this week one unit. So you had the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, and they would collectively become known as the Anglo-Saxons. They gave the name to England, which was Englaland, land of the Angles, and they gave it its language, which is Old English. And we're going to be looking at several characteristics that are significant to this time period, the literature of this time period. The first one is and impersonality, anonymity. Most of the literature written during this time period was written anonymously, which means that people were more interested in the text themselves rather than the poet who composed it. And there was no printing press invented at this time. There were no publishers that were putting these texts to the forefront. Everything was done by hand. Therefore, text would change either due to an unconscious alteration, you write the wrong word down, or to conscious change, where whoever is penning makes a conscious change, a purposeful change. And so as a result, different manuscripts would often differ greatly from one and another all the way through. The literature of this time period is also filled with derivative stories because originality was not a major requirement of medieval authors. There was no idea of intellectual property at the time. It didn't exist yet. So today's time, you can get in a lot of trouble for plagiarizing people's intellectual property. Well, that concept did not exist at this time. So story material was kind of looked at upon as communal property. Anybody could access it and use it as source material. And they believed that to have one's work based off of an older authoritative source, it was a virtue. So as a reader of Middle English literature, you need to be prepared to see less of a personal or individual quality in the writing than we see today in modern literature. Religion it holds a very important place in Middle English literature. It was an important element of the social life during the time period. So men and women, they looked upon religion as a means to the way that they lived their life. And they lived in constant fear of hell, and they were vitally concerned with salvation. And, as a result, the literature of the time is very didactic in nature, which means it's full of teachings and warnings instead of, reading for entertainment. Oral quality, because there were no printing facilities, the literature of the time period was meant to be listened to rather than read. Traveling storytellers, they were called shopes in the Anglo-Saxon language, would travel from place to place, entertaining and telling these stories, which helped the spread of literacy, but it was oral literacy more so than the actual text. It Most of the literature was memorized and retold and retold and retold all the way through. And so books that were printed, and by printing here I mean by hand, right? They were widely unavailable to the masses, and if they were available, the cost of books, the cost of the print itself was hindered people from being able to get their hands on them. And even if they could get their hands on them, education was really fell within the realm of the religious folk. The monks and members of the church were the ones that were educated, and so the whole idea of literacy there, it made more sense for it to spread from word of mouth. Um, when it was written, verse was the normal medium because it was oftentimes shorter, more pleasant to listen to, easier to memorize, and so you'll see a lot of these texts are in verse form, poetry form, rather than in long prose and longer text as well. Okay. The concept of courtly love. So in 1883, a man named Gaston Paris was the first person to kind of coin the phrase courtly love. Um, but it refers to the code of behavior that determined the relationships between lovers during the Middle Ages. So obviously there were rules and requirements, which was first elaborated upon in Ars Amatoria, which is the art of loving. It was written by Ovid, the Roman poet. Okay. A knight who was in love with a married woman of high rank and high birth was required to prove his heroic deeds and present love letters to his beloved without discussing or disclosing his identity. And so courtly love was a secret affair between the lovers. Now, romance also plays a significant part in this time period as well. We're going to see that in several of the knight's texts as well. So just kind of keeping that in mind. All right, the last one is chivalry. Chivalry was a prominent feature of Middle English literature, and it was kind of a code. The Anglo-Saxons called it comitatus, which is kind of like a code of honor or code of behavior, and it is really chivalry came to mean the gallantry and the honor that was expected of knights and that general sense of courtesy. We're going to see that in the Canterbury Tales. We'll see it in even in a little bit in Beowulf and Gowan, where that this code, this idea of the code that was expected of knights at this time. And so most of English poetry that's not concerned with religion is concerned with the heroic deeds of knights.